Period between the 1970s and the 90s was undoubtedly a difficult one for the media in South Africa. Political tensions were at an all-time high, and journalists often found themselves caught right in the middle of the battle between the apartheid government and those pushing for the oppressive regime's end. Well, former Sowetan journalist Sonti Maseko and Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird join us now to reflect on this time and how things have changed, or have they changed since then. Thank you very much, Sonti, William, for your time this morning. And let's start, Sonti, with you. You were actively, you were a journalist at the time and very involved as well. Were there actual clear lines in the reporting as to who was on whose side and how their reporting reflected that at the time?
I'll start by saying this, that if you look at how divided society was in the late 80s, 90s, journalism was also a reflection of that. You had the media, which was largely white, and back in the day, you wouldn't even speak of black media. Surely you had black journalists. Sometimes they would even talk of a captive black press. I like to think of journalism then as, if you think of a small business unit within, a huge industry. So I like to think that black journalism at the time, I mean, you talk of names, big names, we discussed before that, they did their best. They did their best, and bringing South Africa to where it is today. Yes, so yes, it was polarized. Today, media, you'd say it's integrated, but you still talk about who speaks for black people. Yeah, and just very quickly, that I want to go back to, if we talk of the role of the black press. Earlier, during the funeral of the struggle stalwart Winnie Mandela, I think it was her daughter who said the wounds that were inflicted on her were inflicted on us. So black journalists were also oppressed. They wrote stories about themselves. They were not a separate entity from the black community.
They had experienced what they were actually writing about.
Yes.
And William, just looking at the challenges, further challenges that would have faced journalists at that time, where we're looking at if somebody appeared to be biased, if somebody appeared to have a certain tack or to be on a certain side. How do we know, what was being told to them behind the scenes? How do we know whether there were threats to their parents, their siblings, their families, the cats, the dogs, the neighbors, whatever it was? I mean, have we had accounts of that coming through to say, I was forced to do this because otherwise this is what would have happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's good that we kind of reflect on just how bad things were, because perhaps we forget that. So this TV channel didn't exist. It could never have existed. You had as the biggest entity in the broadcaster was the SABC as a state broadcaster, run deliberately to spew out the most vile, vicious, revolting propaganda across all of its services, You then didn't have any of the community radio stations, not nearly as many of the community media, and you had some of these big media entities who, by and large, for almost all of them, were actively supportive of the apartheid regime. Some of that then within there, you found some spaces where people really tried their best to push back against it. And as you saw these states of emergency and things, and the government becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly violent in their responses, there's no doubt that any journalist who even thought that they could say the name, you weren't allowed to say the ANC. That's how bad it was. You couldn't say it. You weren't. If you showed the flag, they would have arrested you, and you could be, remember, detained, arrested without even seeing a lawyer, without anything. You could be detained. They were under no obligation to tell your family. So the threats were very real and very clear. People need to bear in mind that the kind of environment that we've emerged from was the most brutal, extraordinary thing. We talk about apartheid as this thing that just affected some part of society and that it violated rights, but it also created this entire sort of microcosm and society where people were scared to talk and say things.
Yeah.
So make no error, anyone who pushed boundaries on any level would then have been
Became a
subjected to all sorts of pressures.
Well, Sonti, I mean, if we had to compare media today and media then, I mean, now with social media, I mean, the moment I say something on air, I can have 20 people come out and say, what do you mean? Uveka seems to be, you know, taking this side or taking that side. In those days where what you read or what you saw or heard on the radio or what you read in a newspaper, that was the report. Give us some idea as to just, you know, who was reading those stories? How much did they actually take that to actually be the truth? Were people as wise when it came? You know what I mean? Were they wise when it came? Were they more discerning back then without the freedoms that we have now to question the media? And to really take it to heart and say, this is my truth, what I'm reading in this newspaper, and not question it at all. Was that happening? Was that how it was?
That's exactly. I'll just give you an example. I was working for Sowetan, and prior to Sowetan, you had the world. I think even before that, it used to be called the Bantu world. But there was this authority. It was the voice. I'll speak very much, you know, from as a Sowetan reporter. And there was trust. At the height of the repressive laws, the draconian laws that we used to call at the time, you know, you remember the Internal Security Act that provided for detention without trial. At Sowetan, you'd actually have people walking in to break the stories, you know, to say this is what has happened. And even before Sowetan, beyond Sowetan, you had names, Agri Cluster, Joe Tlolwe, Tami Mazwai, John Kwelane. Those were people who were trusted, who broke the stories, you know, because we would empathize. I mean, people would come in looking a mess, or to say, if my family member has just been arrested, or, you know, we were raided last night. So there was that trust. You couldn't divide. So Sowetan, in fact, even in the newsroom, we have well-documented stories of journalists, black journalists, who were members of the banned organizations. Some of them actually even left the country and would show up in Zimbabwe, you know, neighboring states, having openly joined these political movements. So, you know, communities were aware of the hardships that black reporters were laboring under. So there wasn't really a divide. Journalists, yes, are expected to be objective, to report the laws. But it was their communities. It happened to them. Black journalists were subjected to the laws themselves. You'd have the Section 205, where you'd be forced to disclose your sources. Black journalists would be under the stress.
And now you don't actually get it, and then you would go to jail to protect your sources. I mean, now it's not as, I mean, nobody asks you for your source. Because we have email proof and we have files and
in fact,
things
your training as a journalist prepared you for that.
Yeah.
That you'd
One
have
of the first
situations.
rules.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
All right, William, I mean, just looking at, you know, some of the journalists, the likes of Thandeka Kubulu, who's now saying she's hitting back at the Stratcom allegations, also several others. You know, about 40, they estimating about 40 journalists who had been sort of on this or being used by Stratcom or being part of that entire campaign. I mean, the naming of these journalists at this time, and how would they possibly even now try to clear their names or not? How do you go back all of this time and try and say that I was not part of this? Or should we even be questioning the credibility of these journalists based on these allegations that are coming through?
So look, I think that's to go back and do that, you'd need to find some pretty interesting evidence that would identify those people. The trouble is when you're dealing with apartheid thugs, it's not like suddenly they're going to be nice people and say, okay, now this is the honest truth, because now, you know, this is how it is. They lied, they were deceitful then. Who's to say they're not going to do it now to sow dissent at this point in time? So it's not like you can take them at their word, which means you then need some other kind of documentary evidence. What we know about the Nationalist Party government at the time, before negotiations were starting, was that they were shredding millions and millions and millions and millions of files. All of the kind of evidence that could have been used, you know. So there is a lot of stuff that is known and that is within the TRC and that was heard and that is evidenced. And I understand that Thandeka is going to try and see if she can get access to some of that information. But to be able to then go back and identify all those people is going to be a a very difficult thing indeed. But equally, so then to go and name journalists now and say that these are people when there's no shred of evidence, especially when all of the evidence against those identified, in fact, runs exactly contrary to that particular assertion, means that there's other kinds of political forces at play. And the way that you see that is you say, who are the people that are asking and making the allegations? Who are the people that are repeating them? And how do they stand to benefit by suggesting that these people were apartheid spies?
And Sonti, I mean, just to look at if people believed, let's take, for example, I mean, this coming out of the whole Winnie Madikizela Mandela controversy. If people believed, say, for example, that she was behind the Stompie Sepe murder at the time, you also have to look at, while you question journalists, why questioning the party itself, saying why was there no proof put out at the time? While we look and may ask, why did journalists not dig even deeper? Why did they not come out and come out with what was really happening at the time and what was really going on? And now we see, you know, trying to clear her name and revere her. The party itself, was it not forthcoming with some information at the time, or did they play to that media because it served their purposes at the time as well, because they saw her as trouble?
You mean the party being
the ANC at the time?
I'll tell you from my direct experience.
From your experience, having been there, yes. I mean, how cooperative were they in order, you know, trying to clear the names and not use, okay, this is something we can use because she's also
talking during the time when the ANC was a banned organization and a lot of the people who were activists were underground. It was very difficult to arrive at the truth, but specifically during the period of the Mandela United Football Club, people would come to the newsroom and make certain allegations. Again, I go back to my point earlier that editors, sub-editors, reporters came from that same community and they knew what was happening. They knew where to find so-and-so. And there would be a meeting, you know, to see how this could be reported. If you remember at the time, the black newspapers, Sowetan used to be called a comrade courant, you know, by the Afrikaner security forces at the time. And whatever you wrote or you reported, you could give away where people are hiding or, you know, the activities of people who were underground. So you have to be extremely careful about the information that you put out there, about the meetings. Meetings were like underground and things like that. But I remember the conflict. Certainly the activities of the Mandela Football Club and, you know, the Dudu Khilis who were saying, my son has been taken away, a sponge, I think that was. And most of this also played out in court. So I wouldn't say that the ANC could actively manage. There was that absence, exactly. But yeah, you know, we will look with hindsight. You'll say maybe black journalists could have done this. Information was managed. What was put out there, and certain details would not be used. Certain names would not be linked.
Okay, you know, so there was that conflict, like you say, which is understandable.
Yeah. People were conflicted, and it was open in the newsroom. Yes.
In order to not get them in trouble or be able to find them. Okay, I understand that. William, just looking now, I mean, we were looking at, you know, the stories. If we had to look at just what's happening in our own space now with the Guptas and all of the investigations and Gupta leaks and all of that, and the proof that we actually have now. How well protected are we as journalists now, so that 20 years from now, we can't have the same thing being said about you were used by so-and-so and you were fed this information? Do we take for granted that the source and the proof that we are getting and we are using to expose certain things, which more or less are proving to be true along the line, but that there will be absolutely be no disputing this evidence a couple of years from now?
So I think the short answer is yes, partly because we've got an incredible constitution, and that we can't forget that it means that the kind of society we have now talks about how we gather evidence, how we store it. So
capture, yeah, and all of
but there's also the internet. A lot of this stuff is stored in places where it either can't be found or can't be deleted. The problem with that, of course, is that the moment that journalist leaves or moves or they die or something like that, then often that kind of thing may pass away with them, which of course is a problem. But I think at the moment, with the evidence around the Guptas, is it's being supported by overwhelming evidence in relation to, emailed evidence and then court evidence and other documentary proof that's been provided. We don't have the mass, shredding of information and files.
Somebody somewhere will have something.
Unless it's by the, those who are guilty. We know that they're trying to destroy information.
And my final question, which I'd like you both to share the answer to, Sonti, is there any point in going back and having this witch hunt, if we were to call that, against? I mean, we know what happened. We know what the apartheid government did. We know who. We are wiser than that, than what we may have thought, being in a box all those decades ago. What is the point?
I would say there is a point.
Yeah.
There is a point for, again, you go back today very slowly, going through all those interviews Mrs. Mandela gave, what she went through. People paid a price that I don't know if I could pay. And people died, people disappeared. Who were those for? I think there is a point, painful as it is. We can't just say there were no forces behind. You know what happened, and just that price. We can't say forget the past. We haven't even, I would say, as the black community, we haven't even dealt. We very easily, too quickly forgave what happened under apartheid without fully understanding what we've given up.
And in
the story is just beginning.
And it is. And on that point, what I'm asking is there a point in questioning the reporting of the time?
Oh yes, there's a great deal around that, and I think that there's a lot of difficult conversations that we need to have, and investigating the media and the role that it played. I think those are very valuable things. But where we have to be very, very careful is going on unfounded witch hunts against particular targeted individuals, where you go and then say that, because this person's prominent in the media now, therefore this person, so you're seeing all sorts of names of journalists now being taken back and said, he was an apartheid spy, she was an apartheid spy, and that doesn't help us. Do we need to make sure that we know and are aware of the history of how complex it was, of how brutal and awful and the things that we have to answer for? Yes, we do, but that's a very, very different kind of an argument from suggesting that, okay, you were an apartheid spy, off you go, and then again, you've got to be looking at who's doing that and what do they stand to benefit by doing that.
And what was the end result? But we're going to have to
do
do
know
that.
they're unfounded?
That's it.
That's the thing. How do we know they're unfounded? Who says they're unfounded?
Well, that's the start. This is just the start of that discussion. Thank you very much, Sonti and William, for your time this morning. And looking back with us, former Sowetan journalist Sonti Maseko and Media Monitoring Africa's William Burger.